There is a moment in the collapse of every great power when the people living inside it finally understand that the promises they were given were never going to be kept, not delayed, not temporarily suspended, never going to be kept. Iran reached that moment not with a single dramatic explosion or a revolution in the streets, but with something quieter and in many ways far more devastating. It reached that moment when a sitting president walked onto national television, looked into the cameras, and told millions of Iranian families to stop cooking their food, to stop running their fans, to stop using their refrigerators, and to accept living in darkness as the new permanent condition of their lives. He did not say it would be temporary. He did not give a date when the lights would come back on. He asked the Iranian people to restructure their entire existence around the assumption that the power would not be there, that the food would cost more than they could afford, and that the government which had ruled them for 47 years with promises of resistance and dignity and revolutionary glory had nothing left to offer them except instructions on how to suffer more efficiently. That moment did not come from nowhere. It was not created by a single decision or a single strike or a single policy failure. It was the final, visible result of a crisis that had been building for years beneath the surface of a regime that had become expert at hiding the true condition of the country it claimed to be protecting. The food crisis that is now breaking Iranian families was not caused by the war alone. The energy collapse that is now shutting down Iranian industry was not caused by the blockade alone. These catastrophes had roots going back a decade, growing quietly under layers of propaganda and suppression and carefully managed statistics, until the combination of military pressure, economic isolation, and internal mismanagement finally ripped away every layer at once and exposed the full, unmanageable scale of what had been allowed to rot. And here is the detail that is making officials in Washington, in London, in Beijing, in every capital that has spent years studying this regime genuinely struggle to process what they are seeing. At the exact moment that Iran's food supply is failing and its energy grid is disintegrating and its factories are going silent and its people are leaving by the thousands every single day, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is not signaling retreat. It is not asking for negotiations on realistic terms. It is standing at podiums and issuing demands that read like the statements of a government in a position of absolute strength, drawing red lines around a nuclear program it can no longer power, threatening military consequences it can no longer reliably deliver, and telling the United States of America that Washington will need to abandon its conditions entirely before Iran will come to the table. The gap between that public posture and the physical reality of what is happening inside Iran right now is so extreme that experienced analysts who have spent their careers studying revolutionary regimes are using words they almost never use. They are saying they do not know what comes next. And that uncertainty, coming from people who are paid to know, tells you everything about how far outside normal parameters this situation has moved. To understand how Iran arrived at 0 hour, you have to go back before the war, before the blockade, before the strikes on the gas fields and the port operations and the power infrastructure. You have to go back to the water. Because the crisis that is now consuming Iran did not begin with missiles. It began with rain that stopped falling and rivers that stopped running and reservoirs that governments connected to the regime quietly drained for private agricultural operations while official reports described water levels as manageable. Iran's water crisis is not a wartime development. It is a generational catastrophe that the Islamic Republic presided over, accelerated through mismanagement, and concealed through the same institutional dishonesty that characterized its handling of almost every other critical national challenge. The Lard Dam, which supplies water to the greater Tehran metropolitan region, had already fallen to less than 10% of its capacity before a single military operation began. Internal government discussions about what planners were calling Day Zero, the day Tehran's municipal water supply would functionally run out, were happening in closed ministerial sessions years before the current conflict. The river systems feeding Iran's agricultural heartland had been shrinking for decades as upstream diversion projects, many of them connected to Revolutionary Guard-affiliated enterprises, pulled water away from the natural flows that farmers and rural communities depended on. Wetlands that had existed for thousands of years were drying up. Underground aquifers that had taken centuries to fill were being pumped dry at rates that hydrologists were describing as catastrophic. All of this was happening, all of it was documented, and none of it produced the kind of national emergency response that the scale of the crisis demanded, because the regime's priority was never the water. The regime's priority was maintaining the appearance of control. The appearance of control required hiding bad news. Hiding bad news required suppressing the scientists and engineers and civil society organizations that were trying to raise alarms. Suppressing those voices required exactly the kind of institutional authoritarianism that was simultaneously preventing the regime from developing the technical capacity and the transparent governance systems that might have allowed it to actually address the underlying problems. The corruption and the suppression and the mismanagement were not separate failures running alongside each other. They were a single, self-reinforcing system of decline, and the water crisis was one of its clearest early products. When the energy crisis arrived, it arrived on top of water infrastructure that was already failing. Hydroelectric production, which had provided a significant portion of Iran's electricity, had already dropped by nearly half before the first strikes on thermal generation capacity. The dams were not generating power because the dams did not have water. The gas-fired and oil-fired thermal plants that were supposed to compensate for the hydroelectric shortfall were operating on supply chains that were about to be severed. When American and Israeli strikes targeted the South Pars gas fields and the pipeline networks that fed Iran's power generation system, those thermal backup plants did not have an alternative fuel source to turn to. The regime attempted to pivot to diesel generation, but the blockade meant diesel imports had stopped. Every alternative collapsed directly into the failure of another system, because the entire infrastructure had been operating on the assumption that at least some external supply would always be available. When the blockade removed that assumption, the backup plans failed simultaneously. The Iranian people did not experience this as a strategic or geopolitical development. They experienced it as the sound of their refrigerators going silent and the food inside beginning to spoil. They experienced it as the moment the water pump stopped and the tap ran dry. They experienced it as children doing homework by candlelight and factories calling workers to say, "Do not come in because there is no power to run the machines." In cities across Iran, planned power outages were no longer exceptional emergency measures. They became the schedule. 4 hours of electricity, 8 hours of darkness, sometimes less, sometimes nothing for an entire day. The grid was not failing at a single point. It was failing everywhere at the same time, in ways the regime's technical teams could not patch fast enough because patching one gap required resources that were simultaneously needed to address 3 other gaps that had opened while the first one was being worked on. President Pezeshkian's address to the nation was not a policy announcement, it was a confession. When a head of government stands before his people and asks them to be satisfied with 2 lights instead of 10, he is not managing a temporary shortage. He is describing the permanent new ceiling of what his government can provide. He is telling the people that the system which was supposed to serve them has reached the boundary of its functional capacity, and that boundary is going to define their lives going forward. The Iranian people understood what he was saying, even if the words were framed as a temporary sacrifice. They had heard temporary before. They knew what temporary meant in the language of the Islamic Republic. It meant this is now your life. The food crisis running parallel to the energy collapse was not making the situation more manageable. It was making it unsurvivable for millions of families. Inflation had reached 105%. Food prices had climbed 72% in a single year, on top of the 40 to 50% annual inflation that had already been grinding Iranian household budgets into powder for years before the conflict began. A kilogram of chicken that a working family in Tehran could afford in 2022 now required a calculation about which other essential they would go without that week. Bread, which Iranian governments had historically subsidized as a basic social contract with the population, was becoming a luxury budget item for the urban poor. Vegetables, eggs, cooking oil, the staples of a modest Iranian kitchen had all moved beyond the reach of families whose wages had not come close to keeping pace with prices that were doubling and tripling while incomes stagnated. The grocery shelves were not just expensive. They were increasingly empty, because the supply chains that filled those shelves depended on ports that were slowing down, trucks that could not always find fuel, factories that were shutting down, cold storage facilities that had no reliable power, and a distribution network that was unraveling in real time as every node in the system dealt with its own version of the same underlying collapse. Iran's port of Shahid Raji had processed 85% of the country's container traffic before the crisis began. It was not just a port, it was the circulatory pump of the Iranian economy, the point through which food imports, medical supplies, industrial components, consumer goods, and every other category of essential cargo entered the country. When the energy crisis hit port operations, the damage was immediate and cascading in ways that reached every corner of Iranian economic life within weeks. Electric cranes stopped functioning reliably. Night lighting failed, which meant operations slowed dramatically after dark. Cold storage facilities for perishable cargo lost consistent power, which meant food shipments were arriving and then rotting before they could be distributed. Port operations dropped by 40 to 60% almost overnight. Tens of thousands of port workers saw their shifts disrupted and their incomes collapse. When the port slowed, the damage traveled immediately to Iran's 365,000 registered truck drivers, because trucks cannot move cargo that has not been unloaded. Drivers who had built their livelihoods around the rhythm of port operations found themselves waiting in lines for fuel at gas stations where the pump systems themselves required electricity to function. During power outages, those drivers sat in queues for hours just to fill their tanks for journeys that might be canceled before they started. The cold chain between the port and the country's food distribution network broke completely at critical moments. Perishable goods rotted on loading docks. Drivers went home to the same darkness they experienced at the port, facing income collapse and household power outages hitting them from both directions simultaneously. The industrial collapse that followed the logistics collapse was not gradual. It was a wave. The Mobarake steel facility in Isfahan, Iran's largest steel production operation, shut down completely following targeted damage to its power infrastructure. Tens of thousands of workers were sent home without a return date. Steel is not a discretionary product. It is a foundational input for automotive manufacturing, for construction, for infrastructure maintenance, for the production of every category of durable good that an industrial economy depends on. When Iran's largest steel producer went silent, the industries downstream from it began going silent as well. Parts stopped arriving. Assembly lines stopped running. Procurement departments stopped placing orders because there was no point ordering components for a production process that had no power to run. The cascading job losses moved through the economy like a current, and analysts tracking the numbers concluded that somewhere between 10 and 12 million people were at direct risk of income collapse from the industrial shutdown alone. 10 to 12 million people means not just workers, but their children, their elderly parents, their entire extended family networks, the local businesses that depended on their wages, the communities that had organized themselves around the employment those factories had provided for generations. And then the regime lost the one financial mechanism that had been keeping it partially functional despite years of sanctions. For years, Iran had been operating one of the largest state-connected cryptocurrency mining operations on the planet. Mining farms scattered across the country were consuming nearly 2,000 megawatts of electricity, which was effectively electricity being diverted from Iranian civilian use to generate Bitcoin that the regime could convert into hard currency through channels that international sanctions could not easily reach. The operation had been generating billions of dollars annually and had provided the regime with a sanctions-resistant financial lifeline at moments when every other source of foreign exchange was under pressure. When the power grid collapsed, the mining farms went dark along with everything else. The entire crypto financing operation, worth an estimated $7.8 billion in annual contribution to the regime's parallel economy, stopped functioning overnight. The regime did not just lose money, it lost the one tool that had been allowing it to partially finance its military programs and its regional proxy networks through a mechanism that Western financial pressure could not directly touch. That tool was gone, and there was nothing to replace it. What makes the situation not just tragic but genuinely dangerous in ways that go beyond the suffering of the Iranian people is what the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps chose to do in response to all of this. A military and political organization watching the country it controls begin to disintegrate, watching its financial systems fail, watching its people leave and its factories close and its food supplies dwindle, had a choice about how to position itself. It could signal flexibility. It could indicate that the reality of Iran's situation had created conditions for genuine negotiation. It could find a way to move toward a settlement that might stop the bleeding before the bleeding became fatal. The IRGC made a different choice. It chose to escalate its demands. It chose to issue statements insisting that the United States would need to completely surrender its negotiating conditions. It chose to declare its nuclear program and its missile arsenal non-negotiable in the very moment when it no longer had the stable electricity required to run those programs reliably. It chose to draw red lines around a position it demonstrably could no longer defend. The Islamabad peace talks collapsed. The American negotiating team canceled an 18-hour flight to the meetings. That cancellation was not a scheduling conflict. It was a message, delivered in the clearest possible diplomatic language, that the United States was not going to travel halfway around the world to receive lectures from a regime that was asking its own citizens to stop using electricity. Washington was communicating that terms would be set in Washington, not in Islamabad, and that Iran would need to come to the table on American conditions or not come at all. The Iranian delegation returned home with nothing. And yet, IRGC-aligned factions continued issuing statements. They continued framing the situation as one in which Iran held leverage. They continued performing the posture of a powerful revolutionary state in full command of its strategic position. The performance was becoming impossible to reconcile with the reality it was supposed to represent. The reaction in Washington was described by multiple officials not as anger, not as satisfaction, not as the triumphant response of a side that was winning, but as something closer to genuine disbelief mixed with deep unease. Because experienced analysts who had spent careers studying how revolutionary regimes behave under pressure were watching the IRGC's public posture and reaching a conclusion that made them deeply uncomfortable. The IRGC was not performing strength for a domestic audience. It was not executing a calculated negotiating strategy designed to extract better terms. It was in institutional denial. It was an organization that had built its entire identity, its budget justification, its internal culture, its claim to authority over every other faction in Iranian political life, on the narrative of resistance and on the belief that no external pressure could break the Islamic Republic. And it was watching that narrative collide with arithmetic in real time, and it was refusing to process what the arithmetic was saying. The leadership crisis inside Iran was making coherent strategic response essentially impossible. The assassination of Supreme Leader Khamenei had left a succession wound that was not healing. His son Mojtaba had been positioned as the preferred choice of the IRGC's inner circle, but his elevation had immediately triggered fierce resistance from within the clerical and political establishment, where powerful factions viewed dynastic succession as a betrayal of the revolution's foundational principles. The tension between the Revolutionary Guard and the civilian political wing was no longer a manageable institutional rivalry that could be papered over with procedural compromises. It had become an open power struggle, playing out in real time against the backdrop of military pressure, economic collapse, and a blockade that was tightening every week. Every faction inside the regime was calculating not what was best for Iran, but what was best for its own institutional survival in whatever political configuration emerged from the current crisis. Coherent national strategy requires alignment at the top. Iran's top was in open conflict with itself. The countries best positioned to help Iran were choosing not to. China had spent years presenting its relationship with Tehran as a genuine strategic partnership, a counterweight to American power in the Middle East with depth and durability. When the blockade began cutting into Iranian oil exports and the pressure on the regime intensified to levels that threatened its survival, China's response was careful statements expressing concern through official diplomatic channels and nothing more. Beijing was not sending fuel. It was not breaking the blockade. It was not risking its own energy security or its own economic relationship with Washington on behalf of a regime that was visibly losing. Instead, Chinese buyers were quietly turning to Russian oil as an alternative supply source, demonstrating through their purchasing decisions that the strategic partnership with Iran was transactional rather than genuine, and that when Iran needed it most, the calculation in Beijing came down clearly on the side of Chinese interests. The partnership, which Tehran had invested years in cultivating as a lifeline against Western pressure, turned out to be a commercial relationship that functioned only when it was convenient for the commercial partner. Russia was behaving with even more undisguised opportunism. Moscow was benefiting from the disruption of Iranian oil exports because reduced global supply meant elevated prices for Russian oil, and those elevated prices were helping finance the war in Ukraine. From the Kremlin's perspective, a destabilized Iran that kept global energy markets tight was more immediately valuable than a stable Iran that could compete with Russian oil production on international markets. Russia continued selling weapons and ammunition to Iran, maintaining the minimum level of engagement necessary to keep the relationship nominally alive. But it was not going to serve as a strategic rescuer. It was not going to risk a direct confrontation with the United States over a regime that could no longer project the kind of regional power that had made it strategically useful to Russian objectives in the first place. Iran was discovering in the most painful possible way that its relationships with the two countries it had believed would serve as its ultimate backstop were relationships that existed only on favorable terms, and the terms had stopped being favorable. The nuclear program, which the regime had always treated as its ultimate insurance policy, the final card that no external pressure could take off the table, was in worse condition than official Iranian statements would ever acknowledge. Facilities had sustained significant damage in earlier military operations. The blockade was preventing the import of the specialized components and replacement equipment needed to restore damaged centrifuge arrays and processing systems to operational capacity. The regime continued speaking about its nuclear program in terms of strategic deterrence and revolutionary survival, but the physical reality of damaged infrastructure, depleted technical resources, and an energy grid that could not provide stable power to civilian hospitals, let alone to the precision requirements of nuclear enrichment facilities, was creating a gap between the rhetoric and the reality that was becoming technically impossible to bridge. Nuclear weapons development at the level the regime had been pursuing requires sustained, technically complex, energy-intensive industrial capacity. Iran was losing the energy, the supply chains, and the skilled workforce that capacity required, all at the same time. The geopolitical consequences of Iran's nuclear program being damaged but not destroyed were spreading outward in ways that made regional stability planners deeply uncomfortable. Saudi Arabia had quietly resumed internal discussions about its own potential nuclear options. Turkish strategic planners were conducting formal reviews of their country's long-term security posture in a Middle East where the nuclear balance was shifting. The threat of a strong Iran with a nuclear program had kept regional proliferation pressure at a theoretical level for years because the deterrence logic was clear even if the prospect was alarming. The reality of a weakened, desperate, isolated Iran with a damaged but not completely dismantled nuclear program was introducing a different and potentially far more dangerous set of calculations, because desperation and nuclear capability in the same location is a combination that generates instability in ways that strength and nuclear capability does not. The Iranian people living through all of this were responding in ways that the regime's standard toolkit for managing dissent was not designed to handle. The Revolutionary Guard and the Basij had successfully suppressed significant popular uprisings before, in 2019, in 2022, in 2025. The suppression strategy had always followed a consistent pattern. Mass arrests, lethal force in the streets, internet blackouts to prevent coordination, military patrols to physically dominate public spaces, and then a period of exhausted quiet as the immediate crisis subsided. The strategy had worked, in the narrow sense that the regime was still standing after each round. But each round of suppression had required resources, fuel, communication infrastructure, personnel, and logistical capacity. All of those requirements were being degraded by the same energy crisis and economic collapse that was driving people into the streets. The IRGC and Basij could maintain internal control when the regime's broader systems were functioning to support their operations. They were being asked to maintain that control while those systems collapsed around them, and while the men doing the suppressing were themselves going home to dark houses and empty shelves and children asking questions that could not be answered with slogans. This time, the response of the population was not primarily protest, it was departure. Internal displacement had reached 3.2 million people.